Welcome to The Road. This is a weekly podcast of All Saints Lutheran Church. I'm your host, John Pedersen, and I serve as pastor. Each week, we reflect on faith, life, and navigating the road ahead. The language of journey is common when we think about life. It has its joys and challenges along the way, and we all need a little encouragement and guidance at times to keep us going. There's a word in the Bible, asphalia, which means truth, but it's the same root word we use in English for asphalt, if you can believe that. It's a solid surface that makes travel easier and more assured. And so every week we're going to be exploring elements of faith and life that keep us on the road. Faith isn't about living a perfect life. It's about finding our way, getting through rough spots, but seeking out those great vistas too. You can find my weekly message here, but you'll also find special conversations with guests who have insights on things like wellness, parenting, and living with unique purpose. If you appreciate this podcast, remember to subscribe where possible and share it with a friend. Here's this week's message. In 1785, Scottish poet Robert Burns penned these words in a poem called To a Mouse. The best laid schemes of mice and men often go awry and leave us nothing but grief and pain instead of promised joy. That's a modern English translation from his original dialect. His words later provided inspiration to John Steinbeck's own Of Mice and Men. Those aren't the optimistic words most of us want to hear when we set out on some new endeavor and devise new plans, but they are a reminder of the difficult circumstances that we often face. We're over halfway through our series, Community Rising, and it started with the story of Jesus sending his disciples out on a mission. And Jesus didn't just share a message, but he shared a new way of being in relationship with one another. The disciples were now being asked to share that new vision of community. It was a realm that offered healing, spiritual restoration, generosity, and peace for a wider world. And it still does today. This is a vision for community and humanity that encompasses the whole life and well-being of people. It is a hopeful and optimistic vision that doesn't just change the lives of individuals, but it renews the whole community as relationships are restored. Unhealthy patterns are addressed so that the fabric of that whole society can be repaired and made whole again. But from the very beginning and all throughout his ministry, Jesus never glossed over the challenges they would face. Even as he sent them out, Jesus gave the 12 disciples authority over unclean spirits to cast them out and to cure every disease and every sickness. Already there is a suggestion that these best laid plans will hit some complications, even though he gives them the confidence that they will be able to handle it. As Jesus continues to teach his disciples about what this new community will be like and what they can expect in the real world, he turns to parables to make some points. And today's parable of the sower offers a way of talking about the obstacles that emerge when trying to grow a new expression of community. When sharing the word and wisdom that I talked about last week, why doesn't it always seem to connect? The sower in the parable spreads seed almost haphazardly, you might say recklessly, but it really is generous. Seed is precious. It's expensive in modern times to buy in bulk, but it's even more expensive in labor using ancient practices to harvest seed by hand. The sower doesn't seem to mind throwing it anywhere and everywhere. Every inch of ground, whatever it looks like, should receive an opportunity to bring this seed to life. But this is when we find out what happens in 3 locations where the results are a disappointment. The first is on the hardened path, where the seed just sits on the surface. People don't understand the word. They're either not able or not willing to listen. Their hearts and minds are already made up about things. Jesus says the evil one, represented by a bird, snaps up the seed and snatches away the life-giving word. The opportunity for new life doesn't have a chance. In the second case, the seed falls on rocky ground, but it's not rooted in any deeper commitment. This means people hear the word and find joy in it initially, but there's no depth, and the tiny seedling never has a chance to get established. It's not a word of wisdom that they will hold on to when facing any kind of challenges. Jesus says, such a person has no root, but endures only for a while, and when trouble or persecution arises on account of the word, that person immediately falls away. In the third case, the seed falls into soil that does have some depth, but there are other plants or weeds competing for the same space. Sometimes the word and the call to follow comes amidst other priorities. Jesus says, the cares of this age and the lure of wealth choke the word, and it yields nothing. So to simplify, we could say, hardened, shallow, and preoccupied lives make it difficult for wisdom and new life and expressions of community to emerge. St. Paul, in his writings, later grapples with this very reality of trying to create new Christian communities as he travels throughout the Mediterranean. He later writes about his experience in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, about his experience in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. We do not want you to be ignorant, brothers and sisters, of the affliction we experienced in Asia, for we were so utterly unbearably crushed that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death, so that we would rely not on ourselves, but on God, who raises the dead. This was Paul's own reflections on the drama and frustrations of trying to spread the gospel widely along with Christian community. But the parable says there are moments when the seed of the word actually does find good soil. Jesus says, this is the one who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit. It can seem almost a miracle when things work as they're supposed to. Someone actually hears and listens. They understand the wisdom and spirit of what Jesus taught and the implications of it, and they help bring it to life. This final statement about bearing fruit and yielding 100-fold, 60 or 30, illustrates the end goal or result that really is just natural. What is the hope in the end? Life in abundance. As Jesus himself says in John 10:10, I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. Our life together should be life-giving. Community as a whole is supposed to be a place where we share in the life that God intended, where we can celebrate our blessings, look after one another, and where someone is lacking or in need can be restored to life. It's helpful and important to read this parable on an individual level. It makes us wonder, what kind of soil am I? Is my heart and spirit like a hardened path, not open to a timely word of wisdom? Is it rocky with just thin layers of soil that don't allow God's word and wisdom to grow deeper? Or does this timeless and spiritual task just get crowded out by all my other priorities? Asking the personal spiritual question about our readiness is one way to hear this parable. Others wonder if the point of the parable has more to do in the end with the generous Spirit of God who is the sower. Again, the seed is spread liberally everywhere, nothing held back. Everyone is given the opportunity to receive it and respond, even to the point that some might even see the sower's generous approach as foolish. And yet, as we consider the state of our own hearts and spirits, that very act of self-reflection may be like a hoe dragging across our hardened soil. It breaks the surface of the dirt, leaving a small opening, perhaps for a single seed. How we respond has the potential to impact not just us, but others as well. If we embrace God's message of compassion and justice that has the potential to shift a community. It's true that individuals may be unreceptive or unprepared for God's wisdom, but it's true that communities can be resistant as well. Instead of being tolerant, some can seek to consolidate power and cut others out. Instead of being generous, groups who possess much can become even more insatiable and hoard resources for themselves at the expense of others. Instead of being gracious toward the other, they can become harsh and punitive. Why is it that at sometimes it's easy to find good soil and in other seasons it's not. When you drive through rural counties of Minnesota or Iowa, there are miles and miles of farmland and great soil. Of course, work has gone into making that possible. But then you can drive through other parts of the country in arid, even desert regions or industrial zones, and it's hard to imagine much taking root there. There are also seasons of drought when even the best soil can't support crops well. As I was reflecting on this parable and descriptions of the various kinds of people and conditions of the heart, I recalled another set of descriptions of people from another time and place. In what was a letter to his family and friends after 10 years of the church's struggle against fascism in Germany, Dietrich Bonhoeffer reflected on a number of things, including the responses of people that had good intentions but hit dead ends over those 10 years. He goes on to identify 6 types of people or responses, and I recognize it might be hard to take in every bit of each of those 6 today, but I invite you to listen for those parts that resonate with you. First, he lists the reasonable ones, those who think with the best of intentions and in their naive misreading of reality that with a bit of reason they can patch up a structure that has come out of joint. With their ability to see impaired, they want to do justice on every side, only to be crushed by the colliding forces without having accomplished anything at all. Disappointed that the world is so unreasonable, they see themselves condemned to unproductiveness. They withdraw in resignation or helplessly fall victim to the stronger. Second, and more devastating, he says, is the failure of all ethical fanaticism. The fanatic believes that he can meet the power of evil with the purity of a principle. But like the bull in the arena, he attacks the red cape rather than the person carrying it, grows tired, and suffers defeat. He traps himself in the insignificant and ends up in the trap of the cleverer one. Third, he identifies the man of conscience who has no one but himself. But counseled and supported by nothing but his very own conscience, he is torn apart. The innumerable, respectable, and seductive disguises by which evil approaches him make his conscience fearful and unsure that he finally settles for a salved conscience instead of a good conscience. That is, until he deceives his own conscience in order not to despair. Fourth, the reliable path of duty seems to offer escape from the bewildering plethora of possible decisions. Here, that which has been commanded is clutched as the most certain. The responsibility for what has been commanded lies with the one giving the command rather than the one who carries it out. The man of duty will in the end have to do his duty also to the devil. Fifth, there is the one who determines to take a stand in the world by acting on his own freedom. He values the necessary action more highly than an untarnished conscience and reputation. He is prepared to sacrifice a barren principle to a fruitful compromise, or a barren wisdom of mediocrity to fruitful radicalism. He will condone the bad in order to prevent the worse, and in so doing no longer discern that the very thing that he seeks to avoid as worse might well be better. This is where the basic material of tragedy is to be found. Sixth, in flight from public discussion and examination, this or that person may well attain the sanctuary of private virtuousness, but he must close his eyes and mouth to the injustice around him. He can remain undefiled by the consequences of responsible action only by deceiving himself. In everything he does, that which he fails to do will leave him no peace. He will either perish from that restlessness or turn into the most hypocritical of all Pharisees. And so finally, Bonhoeffer gets to his version or equivalent of the good soil. the one faithful response. He asks, who stands firm? Only the one whose ultimate standard is not his reason, his principles, conscience, freedom, or virtue. Only the one who is prepared to sacrifice all of these when in faith and in relationship to God alone, he is called to obedience and responsible action. Such a person is the responsible one, whose life is to be nothing but a response to God's question and call. And by obedient and responsible action during this time, he always turned back to our responsibility to love and care for the other and the neighbor as our response to God's call. He spoke about a view from below in which we learn to see with empathy as Jesus did from the depths of the cross. His final haunting question is, where are these responsible ones? Bonhoeffer was speaking from the context of a season of drought, when the faithfulness of the church had collapsed. Even many of those who had fought the good fight in the earlier years had become exhausted and given up, as he describes in the 6 troubled responses he had observed. Across Christian history in the time of Jesus, Paul, Bonhoeffer, and our own, and many others, we continue to come back to the question of why this wisdom and good news of a loving God is so often rejected. Why is it not understood or received fully into our hearts or our common life? We ask that question of ourselves. Why do we allow our hearts to become hardened, resistant, and distracted, preventing us from tending to the one thing? And is it possible for these soils and responses to be changed, for our hearts to be changed, our neighbors' hearts, even the life of a nation? Healthy and thriving communities are made up of individuals, and they depend on responsible action from each individual. The parable of the sower provides no final answer on that question of whether we can change our soil. It only speaks in the end to the heart of God, which is a heart of reckless and foolish generosity and grace. God scatters the seed of his wise and gracious way of life and the healing ways of his reign into our very midst. The seeds continue to fall even today, in this moment, seeds of hope and renewal, seeds of compassion and love. We can only pray for our spirits to open and to receive them along with all who hear them, that God's vision of life may finally be experienced by all. Amen. That's this week's message. You don't have to navigate the road ahead alone. You can join with others at All Saints. Visit allsaintsmtka.org for more information. Have a great week.